should zoom close to the thing. Okay, good morning. We'll talk today a little bit about the Gatos of Rus. And we'll first start with just to refresh, the story of Rus. Rus is a whole sefer in Tanakh. It's a Ksuvim. One of the Chumash Megillas. And Rus is actually a fascinating story, but that's it. All it is a story that Nach doesn't do anything with it. No hira, no lesson, no nothing. All it is a it's a very, very fascinating story that we're going to go through quickly before we talk about the halachas that can be learned from it. So the story of Rus briefly is, and the story goes that in Eretz Yisrael there was a family of Elimelech, who was, the Gemara tells us that he was from the Gdolei Adoir. He's from the wealthiest and the greatest politically as well. He was Talmid Chacham. He was very wealthy also politically. He was from the Mishpacha of the Shoftim. The Shoftim at the time were like the kings. He was from the Mizera HaMelucha. We'll see later, his nephew was a Shofet. His father was a Shofet. He didn't make it all the way to the top, but he was way up there. And there was a famine in Eretz Yisrael, so Elimelech and his wife and his two sons, again, like before we start, Barus is full of a story that there's a lot of parts of it that we can learn very nice lessons from, and parts of it that we can learn less nice lessons from. So Elimelech went and he abandoned his brethren instead of staying with them as leader, and he ran to Sdei Moav. He ran to Moav. As soon as he came to Moav, Elimelech passed away. His two sons living in Moav, relatively comfortably, they went ahead and they married two Moaviyos, two Moavite women. One of them, we know, being Rus, was a daughter of the king. She was a daughter of Eglon Melech Moav. They went and married them. They should go often. Very soon, they both passed away as well. So Nomi, his wife, was left with two daughter-in-laws. And Saras kept on hitting her. And eventually, she lost all her money. So she was left in Moav now, penniless, familyless, and just had these two daughter-in-laws with her. Elimelech. She had nothing to do in Moav anymore. Again, she was there poor and broken. She heard that the famine was over in Eretz Yisrael, so she decided to go back to Eretz Yisrael. Her daughter-in-laws, this is a good part, had a great, great devotion to the mother-in-law, did not want her to leave alone. So they were adamant about going back to her with her to Eretz Yisrael. I think there's no shadows about that. That's what we're going to get into. That's what we're going to talk about today. That's a share. So the two daughter-in-laws were adamant, had a devotion, great devotion. They didn't want to leave their old mother-in-law alone. She wasn't that old, alone and lonely. They wanted to follow her back there. So Rus kept on pushing them back. Orpah accepted, and she stayed in Moav, went back home. Rus followed her all the way to Eretz Yisrael. They came to Eretz Yisrael, just to understand how poor they were. They came to Eretz Yisrael. This is Peri Beis. They had nothing. So we know Aniyim are entitled to Leket Shikha Peah. They can go to the fields and they can get whatever was dropped by the collectors, whatever they leave behind. So Rus, she was a princess Amal, but had a great devotion for her mother-in-law, was going to be with her through thick and thin. She told her mother-in-law, I'll go out to the Sunday. She went out and she's... That's by going to, by the way? I'm just curious. I think they're going to take, you can't stop it. So she came and she started to collect. But when going to it's not because of the fog, you can't stop it. I don't know. We don't find this in here. I don't know. You have to leave it. I don't think you have responsibility to know who takes it. You have to leave it. Fine. So let's just go through the storyline quickly. So Rus was collecting. It so happens to be Mashgach Pratis, that she ended up in the field of Boaz, who Boaz was her husband's, her former husband's first cousin. There was, who was a goyel. What does it mean he was really a goyel? What happened really was that we know the mitzvah of Yibum, that if a woman passes away without children, that her brother-in-law is responsible to take as a mitzvah of Yibum to marry her and rebuild his brother's family. Although the mitzvah, as the mitzvah applies only by a brother, but conceptually, Yibum and Geula applies by a larger radius, by relatives Bechlal. But the mitzvah, the Torah only commands it by Yavam. So she ended up by Boaz, who was really a goyal. He was the closest living relative. But Boaz, he knew about it. Rus didn't know about it, but he didn't do what really he should have done. Instead, he treated her as a beggar, but a little better. He gave her preferential treatment. He told his workers to drop more food on the field so she should have what to collect, and so on and so forth. Rus, Nomi, her mother-in-law, when she came home and told her who it was, she knew that this was the goyal, and she was really hoping that throughout the whole season that he would step up to the plate and be goyaler, offer a marriage, and rebuild his brother's family. The season finished, he didn't do it. So they were at a loss. They didn't know if they're ever going to meet again. So finally, Rus, Nomi, told her daughter-in-law, we got to be a little more bold. We got to be a little more aggressive. And there was going to be an outdoor party that was done by sort of the end of the harvesting. And she told her, you go, they sleep in the field at night, you go. He was a shofet. I didn't mention that. Boaz was a shofet. He was like the king of the Eden. You go to sleep by his feet, and you uncover him. And when he gets up in the middle of the night, Chatzos Laila, to learn, you're just going to have access to him, and you're going to ask him a point-blank question, will you marry me? Will you step up and do your responsibility, do what you're supposed to? She did that. So he answered her that the reason why I didn't do it, or not ready to do it yet, was because really you think that I'm the closest living relative, I'm the first cousin. Really, one of our uncles is still alive. We don't want to say his name, Pliny Almoini, because his name is really Toiv. But the Nach wasn't Pliny Almoini, nameless. And he says, I'm really willing to do it, but I first have to get his permission because it works with a hierarchy, the closest relative. She went. She asked. He went the next day. He asked his uncle if he wants to be goyler. He refused. He went ahead and married her. They got married. She became pregnant. The next day, Boaz was a very old man at the time. He died, but he had Boaz, had Yishai, had Rus, had Yishai, and that's where David comes from, and that is the end of the story. So really, generally, what we learn from the story is there's the good parts that we learn from Rus, how devotion, chesed, how she didn't give up her mother-in-law, and even later, the Navi tells us that more than that, even a greater chesed was that in order to rebuild her husband's family, she was willing to marry Boaz, who was an old man who was already deathly ill, who died the next day. Instead of, she was very young at the time, she could have just married anybody. That chesed. And then we learn from other things about abandoning, about Melech, Machlon, Killian. We learned some lessons, and maybe we should behave a little differently. That is the storyline of Rus. There's one more thing important to note, that Rus was really very, very young at the time. She was a girl, and she wasn't like that David Melech was an Uranical, like our great grandparents that we never even met. They lived in Europe, never even made it to America. Rus outlived David Melech. She passed away during the middle of Shlomo's, during the lifetime of Shlomo. So she was really a Ema Malchus, active mother, great-grandmother of a mother of the king. She wasn't just a descendant that he was Megezaros. She was present right, left, and center throughout David's Melucha. So the question we really have here is, we have the question that Rabbi asked, that what's going on here? When was Rus this guy? We know that Rus was a Gioides, so Mayavia was a Gioides. But at what point in the story, what did Rus become a Gioides? And seemingly we find that there is a machlokes, because we find some sukkim that point this way, that Rus became a Gioides already before Machlon married her, back in Moav, before she got married. And the other sukkim that point that no, she was a shiksa then, and she only became a Gioides when she followed her mother-in-law into Eretz Yisrael, or maybe even later when she married Boaz, is when she became a Gioides, 3 possible times. And seemingly we find different sukkim pointing in different ways, and we're left with a very, very big machlokes. So let's go through it. So I made a little chart where we collected some of them. There's more, but we'll run through them quickly. So we're going to start with that Rus only became a Gioides once she was married, and Machlon and Killian married her while she was still a Goya, and they married her B'Isser. So the first pasuk is at the B'daik on the pasuk says, "Vayisulem nashim nachriyos." The pasuk says that they married nachriyos. Nachriyos are nachrim goyim. They married a goyish woman, and it's mefurish in the Targum. The Targum says Vayisu, and the Targum explains va'avru hagzeiras me'emdad Hashem. And these people, Machlon and Killian, they transgressed the commandment of Hashem. and they took Nashin Uchraim, Goyish women. Vayamusu. And the Targum therefore explains that is why Machin and Killian died. Why did Machin and Killian die? Because since they transgressed the Abish's commandment, and they married Goyish women, the days were chopped, and they both died. And likewise, they married them as Goyis. Another ayah, Rashi brings a ayah. Rashi and Rus brings a ayah. This is already a logic ayah. Rashi brings a ayah. When Rus was trying to convince her daughter-in-laws to go back to their families, so she tried different tactics. One of the tactics was she said, "Listen, I'm already an old woman. I will never have any more children. So there's nothing to wait for." Again, it was common if somebody's husband died, that they would wait for the brother to grow up because that's how it worked. It was Ibum in a larger sense, brothers, relatives. She says, "I'm an older woman. Will I bear any more children? Never. So there's nothing to wait for. Go back home." Now, we know the din is that Yibum is only allowed if the brother was already alive when his brother passed away. Let's say Reuben passes away without children, and he already has a brother Shimon. Shimon has to be Miyab. But if Shimon wasn't born yet, and Shimon was only born later after Reuben passed away, then not just he has no chiyuv of Yibum, he's not allowed to be Miyabim, and it's Aroy, he says, so Rashi asks a question. She was telling them there's nothing to wait around for. What do you mean nothing to wait around for? Even if she was young and she could still have children, those children would not be able to marry you. So Rashi says, you know why they were able to marry her? Because they were goyis. And since they were goyis, they were never really married. So there's no ishasach. So even children that will be born later would be able to marry. So that's Rashi's raya. Why would they? So why would they have to? They wouldn't have to. The answer is that Yibum is really not I'm not going to say this the right way, but Yibum is not really a Yiddish thing. Which means Yibum is really something that was done in the world, the ancient world, before the Torah was given. And then the Torah just incorporated Yibum into Torah and made Yibum by a brother divine. That it became a mitzvah. The Torah is Chat Shalach. But Yibum was really way back. That was a derech way the world ran. She wasn't talking about the chiyuv. She was telling them as the way the world runs. On the way around for you, waiting around for it, not as a mitzvah. But Rashi says, Alpidin, they couldn't do it, but if they're goyis, they could. Another ayah we have is when Rus was pushing them, when Nomi was pushing them back, she said, "Go back to your nation and go back to your gods." Seemingly, they still belong to the other nation, to the Goyish nation, and still had Goyish gods. And furthermore, if they were Yidden and she was pushing them away, then Rus would be what? Nomi would be what? A mesis and media. The biggest avein in the Torah possibly is what? Is to push somebody to push somebody away from Hashem. So if they were Yidden, if they were going, they were going. So again, this is a double ayah. First of all, for the Lashon of Pasuk, go back to your nation and go back to your God. Seems they still belong to the Moav nation, they still had Moav gods. And also, if they were Yidden, she wouldn't be able to do that. She would be over on the Isra of Mesis and Media. Biggest sister, another proof that they were goyis. Further proof, when they were going to Eretz Yisrael, interesting pasuk, and maybe if we have time after we'll do it. There's a long pasuk while they were going to Eretz Yisrael that we learn all the din hagiur from. All the din hagiur I learned from two long psukim. Amech amech and the koyib shetamus amos amos aviad lashna pasuk pashatei lechelech with all the hagiur from. So what do we see from there? That pasuk is when on their way to Eretz Yisrael. So we see when did they become Geiris? At what point? Not before they got married in Moab 10 years earlier. Rather, when did they become Geirim? Geiris? On the way to Eretz Yisrael. There's a Rashi. Again, Rashi holds it with Goyis originally. There's a Rashi that Rashi holds that they became a Geiris not just when they moved to Eretz Yisrael, but rather later when they married Boyaz. Because Rashi teaches V'rachatzton. Nobi told Rus before she went to marry Boyaz v'rachatz, and you will wash yourself. And Rashi explains what was she referring to? Wash yourself off from a Vedazara, become a Yid. Again, a later date. And then we also have a Gemara. The Gemara Bava tells us that really Machlin and Killian were not the real names. The real names are Yoyosh and Sarov. Machlin and Killian were nicknames they got because of actions they did. And the Gemara tells us why was Machlin called Machlin? Because he made his guf chol. He defiled his body. That's why he got the nickname of Machlin. How did he defile his body? The Mashal explained by marrying a goy. So we have here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 B'dayis, seemingly that when did they get married? When did they become Giyadis? Either when they moved to Eretz Yisrael, or perhaps even later, right before the marriage to Boaz. But when Machlin and Killian married them, they were Moisim Chet al Pesha. Besides them abandoning the Yidden and leaving Eretz Yisrael, they were the leaders, and they ran away from the nation. What did they do? They left so far that what did they do? They married Goy Yeshuim. And many shittas hold this way. Flip side, we'll go to the other side of the chart. We have other shittas that they hold fakert, that they were Giyadish from before. First of all, Ibn Ezra writes, it's impossible to say they'll aid and approve it from a pasuk, and the pasuk he proves it from El Amav El. Interesting, because before everybody else used that pasuk to prove, nobody telling them go back to your nation, go back to your gods. We use this as proof that they're really still goyis. I'm not sure how, but Ibn Ezra uses that pasuk as a raya that they were Yidden. The Zohar says in Befedish. That they were Yidden. The Zohar as a whole, I didn't read the whole Zohar, I didn't quote the whole Zohar. The Zohar is an interesting thing. The Zohar gets caught up with, and we see whenever people became Giyadis, Nomi told them, go back to your nation and go back to your God. So the Ibn Ezra learns from that they were really Yidden. I don't know how, but he learns from that. The Zohar is an interesting Zohar. The Zohar Chadar says that really, whenever we see in the Torah, whenever people became Gadim, they always took on Yiddish names. So the Zohar asks, how come Rus, she became a Giyadis and she moved to Eretz Yisrael, how come she didn't take on a Yiddish name? Seemingly, when she became a Giyadis and moved to Eretz Yisrael, she should have given up the name Rus and taken on a Yiddish name. So the Zohar answers, no, because Rus is her Yiddish name. And when did she take that name on? Before she married Machlin and Killian. The year was really way back. And he concludes by saying it's impossible to say that they would marry Goyas. Another thing is, at the end of when Boaz does marry her, some of Farshim say that he was Mekayim, the mitzvah of Yibum. Yibum, like, is only by Yidden. Another ayah we have, the Gemara says, Machlin and Killian, why did Machlin and Killian die? Because they left Eretz Yisrael. Seemingly, if they married Goyas, then they had a much greater Aveda at hand, which Aveda did they have? The Aveda of marrying Goyas. So we should have said, so proves that they married Yidden. So we have over here quite a few proofs this way, quite a few proofs that way, and that's why if you go into earlier in the Farshim, they say either some hold this way, some hold that way, and some of them say straight out that's a machloikis, whether Rus's gear was before she married Machlin and Killian and they did the right thing, or they did the wrong thing, married her as a goye, and she only became a Giyadis when she moved to Eretz Yisrael, or according to Rashi, maybe even at a later date when she actually did it. Later, people became more creative. The first one to become more creative was the Bach. Bach has a sefer called Meshiv Nefesh, which is a Piddush on Rus. And the Bach comes up with a very, very creative way that what he does is he wants to show that Livrei Shnei Emes, that they're both true, all the psukim fit. That we're going to quote the Bach, even though some people are not 100% happy with the Bach, and then they tweak it. Other people tweak it a different way, but they all go along the same. They all follow the same road, the same path. The Bach comes along. He's the first one, so we're going to bring the Bach, even though he's not the most perfect one, because some people have questions on the Bach, and then they amend it, tweak it, and so on. But the Bach is the first. The Bach comes in a very, very interesting shot. And the interesting shot of the Bach is he says that we find a very similar thing. We find that Shlomo Melech, we know it says the pasuk that Shlomo Melech married Goyish women. We find that Shimshon, he married, his wife was Philistine. And the pasuk says she was a Goyah. And the Rambam asks that how can it be, the Rambam in Yad HaChazakah, the Rambam asks, how can it be that Shlomo, he asks more about Shlomo Melech, how can it be that Shlomo Melech would marry a Goyah? Shlomo Melech would never do such a thing. So the Rambam explains, it's in Yad HaChazakah, the Rambam explains that Shlomo Melech really married a Giyodis. He was Megayah. But because that this marriage was a marriage of convenience, which means why did he marry these women? It was other princesses. Shlomo married 1,000 women. Most of them were princesses of other tribes and other things. That was a way of consolidating power and consolidating wealth. That's why things were done amol. Probably that's the reason also why Machlin married Rus. Somebody came from the war, consolidating power, wealth, whatever it was. So Shlomo HaMelech married these Goyish women. So the Rambam says he was Megaya them. He was Megaya them. Chaz v'shalom to say Shlomo HaMelech wasn't Megaya them. If so, why does the Torah call them Goyis? Why does the Torah call them Goyis? Nochrius? Because since their gear was a gear at a convenience for a purpose, the sake of marriage, we were never really sure if they were real Gadim or not Gadim. And we always had this suffix. And that's why we always call them Goyis. Like we see some of Shlomo's wives actually weren't real. They served the Avodah Zarah in his house, in his place. They weren't really committed. They said they were committed for the sake of the marriage, but they weren't really committed. So the Bach says a similar thing. That Rus and Orpah, they got married again. This was supposed to be a consolidation of power, avoiding war, consolidation of wealth, whatever you want to call it. And we really, really weren't sure if their Gatus was a good Gatus. That's why the Pasuk refers to them as what? As Moaviyos, because we weren't sure. And that's why Rus pushed them away, because what did she feel? Now will be the real test. Your husbands are gone. The wealth is gone. We're going out there to Yisrael as what? As paupers. If you're committed, come along. Then automatically, if they came along Rus, then she didn't become a Giyotis then. Then what did that show? That really she was a Giyotis all along from the beginning. But Arpo gave it up. What did she show? That no, I only became a Yidna for what? For the marriage, for the wealth. Now that's all gone. I'm going back home. What did that show? That Shimei Kara was never ever a Yid. So now
the retroactively you can undo it.
It's not undone. It was never done. It was never done. That showed that she was never really a Yid. So therefore, everything we pointed fits with this. Why was Rus able to push them away? Nobody able to push them away. Now to push away Yid. Because if they left, she wasn't pushing away Yid. What was she doing? She was just confirming that really what was she? She was a Goy. So that is the pshat of the Bach. There's questions in the Bach, because seemingly halachically, even if you have a gatus and you later turn back and we see that you weren't real, you're still a Yid. So therefore they tweak it a little bit and they amend it a little bit. And there's different malachim how to do it, but the kav is the same. This is the kav of the Bach. They had a gatus that was a questionable gatus, and what Rus was doing was testing them to see we can either affirm their gatus now and show that they were really gatus all along, and that works with all the psukim that show that they were gatim, or we could show if they left that they really weren't gatim, and that confirms that they were never gatim achatchila, and that's what we call them goyim, and that's why it all fits. That's why Rashi says he could have married them, whatever. That's why it all fits 100%. All the psukim based on the start. So that's another mahal. Another mahal is that they don't want to accept the mahal that it was the reason why the gatus was questionable. There's another mahal that they don't want to accept that it's very similar, but they don't want to say that the gatus was questionable because it was a marriage for the sake of marriage. It was la halacha. At the end of the day, that's irreversible. Even if a woman got married and we know the fetish was for the sake of marriage, and later she goes back to Shiva V'Tzadeh, she still eat. So they do. We know that Rus and Arpa were very young, which is not uncommon. People that got married, very, very young women, and it's also Befedish and Toisvis, that they were Ketani Soyu. Toisvis has a Befedish. So also a Koton, when they become Bar Bas Mitzvah, what they have to do is they also have to do a Kabbalah mitzvahs. They get a right, they opt out or opt in. So they take that mahala. But also that's what Rus was doing then. She was giving the choice. Nomi was giving them then the opt in, opt out. Others do that it was emo. They were afraid, they were forced into the marriage. They weren't doing it for money, they were forced. those marriages are also, those gators can also force them to the gators. But it's all the same. They're all following the box chop, just with different tweaking it this way, tweaking it that way. Sorry? Which? I don't know if it's a modern one. It's now from a Moshe Steinbock. Well, that's the most recent. He's the most recent. Yashikoyach.
Bye-bye.